Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Professor Bart K is a returning guest on our show. Check out his first appearances on episode 445 and 613 of Boundless Body Radio, the first of which was our most popular downloaded episode of 2023. Professor Bart K is a former senior lecturer in cardiovascular and respiratory physiology, exercise physiology, nutrition, research methods, and statistics. Professor K has published a number of peer-reviewed research and review articles, as well as book chapters. Professor K has successfully taught aspects of physiology, anatomy, biochemistry, metabolism and nutrition, and research design and statistics since 2001, both in the United Kingdom and in Australasia. He has consulted regarding optimizing physical performance to the New Zealand All Blacks, the National Rugby League Referees Association in New Zealand, the Royal Australian Defence Force, and the Royal New Zealand Army. Bart has a number of publications in the areas of exercise physiology, biochemistry, metabolism, nutrition, statistics, and physiological performance modeling. You can find Bart on Facebook at nutrition.science.watchdog, or more popularly on his YouTube channel, which is wildly popular, called the Professor Bart K Main Channel. Bart K, what an absolute honor just to welcome you back to Boundless Body Radio.
Thank you, Casey. It's an absolute privilege and a pleasure, as always, to be with you.
It's always great to see you. We tend to record sometime, usually right after your birthday. You're a year older at 53. You look amazing. And you and I were talking, interestingly, about two different things, two different people who have influenced you in your life, one a little bit more personally than another. But maybe you could share with the audience something that you and I were talking about, first about your age.
Yeah, so very recently I turned 53 years of age, and I hadn't really even thought about this, but my mother was there on the day visiting me here, and she sort of said, well, with the passing of another year, with you turning 53, did you realise you've outlived your father? And I hadn't thought of that. My late father died of heart disease aged 52 some years ago, and so that was I don't know if that's much of an achievement to make it to 53. I'm planning on, many more than that, much to the chagrin, I'm sure, of many people. But that's for another day. But the most important thing, I think, today, because it's more a today thing, is that I would like to pay tribute to Dr. Richard K. Bernstein, who was a pioneer in the treatment of type 1 diabetes, the management of type 1 diabetes. Richard himself was a type 1 diabetic, and sadly he's past age 90.
Yeah, that's I was unaware of that, so I appreciate you bringing that up. What an incredible influence, learning his story and what he had to go through, and actually training as a doctor after discovering what he discovered about insulin and how he could control his type 1 diabetes just by lowering carbohydrates. A friend of mine, just kind of like a social media friend of mine, just started posting about their son who was just diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And you see the kid in the hospital, and of course he's holding the toast and all this stuff. And this family's overwhelmed and they're being told certain things. And so, you want to share, you want to bring it up. And I sent him a message. I'm like, look, man, I'm so sorry for what you're going through. This is something that a lot of type 1 diabetics have used and has really helped them. Watch this, 45-minute, hour-long documentary called The Diabetes Solution if you want. This will give you some alternatives. I also offered to introduce him to several of my friends who we've hosted on the show who are type 1 diabetics, and more than willing to help the family. And, of course, the family's really overwhelmed, and they ended up not doing any of it, and they're having a really tough time. So it's hard to see that, and I think there's a lot of resistance to the idea that carbohydrates have anything to do with disease, especially when you're told something in the hospital. So Richard Bernstein did an amazing job, and his book is completely transformative. So thank you for sharing that. And yeah, we'll definitely remember him in the highest regard. Talking to you, and so sorry to hear about your father as well. I'm 41 right now. I lost my mom at 46 to breast cancer, so I'm coming up on a similar date here in a few years as well. So tough times. Before we dive into our topic today, remind the audience, who you are and how you got interested in nutrition and landed in the idea that a carnivore diet is a species-appropriate type diet.
Right. Well, I think you did an admirable job in the introduction here of outlining my professional background, my academic background, I guess. So I don't really need to say much about that. What I will say is that out of being involved in academia, science, the production of science, the communication of science for a couple of decades, I I have developed a healthy disrespect for just about everything that goes on in that industry, which is a sad thing to have to report, but nonetheless, that is the case. Most notably in the fields of health science, and in particular in nutrition science for human beings, the whole idea that nutrition science even exists is a fallacy. It's a falsehood. It's nonsense. And if we get to that today, we'll get to it, but we've got some other nonsense to deal with perhaps before we get to the more instructional stuff. We'll see how we go on time. I'm actually okay for 90 minutes if we need to go there, Casey, but that's entirely up to you. How did I get interested in it? I got interested in it because, having been through a program of indoctrination to gain my credentials, I realised pretty quickly that everything I was being taught was absolute nonsense. Or the stuff they were trying to teach me was absolute nonsense. And then I spent 2 decades establishing the nonsensical nature of that before deciding better of that and thinking, well, actually I can influence more people as a social media personality. So I developed a character or a characterization, which is this bloke I play on YouTube, the grumpy professor who says a lot of short words and who calls everybody out on their crackpottery and is very, very uncharitable with people who don't share the same ideas. People need to understand that's a character. That's for clicks. It's a social media engagement tool that I've used. I'm thinking about modifying that going forward because while ever it is a good hook to get people engaged in the first place, it's also self-limiting because there is a large percentage, I guess, of the general population who actually don't get alongside that kind of behaviour. So we may be seeing something different in the future. Watch this space. Anyway, that brings us up to date.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And whether you want to start with the crackpottery that is going around in our world from time to time, or talk about something that you and I have not talked about that much before, which is in your wheelhouse, and we haven't really even taken that much of a deep dive into it, the statistics and the way that studies are done and how we should read and interpret some of these studies. Where would you like to start with that? Would you like to start with crackpottery, or would you like to start with something positive?
Well, let's deal with some of the topical crackpottery because we can do that quite quickly. And then I thought, almost as a public service, almost as an instructional pseudo lesson, we could run through some of the basic rules of the disciplines of communicating the inference that science can make and the limitations of some of the inferences that science cannot make that perhaps less educated folks, with regard to science specifically, make the mistakes of putting ideas forward that are demonstrably unacceptable. So let's deal with the crackpottery first.
That sounds great. It was a post that I saw you comment on that I had never heard of the idea, and you brought something up, and it was something about bones. If you're eating a carnivore diet, something can happen to your bones. I'd never heard it. It sounded so strange to me. I didn't give it much credence. Can you give us a little bit of background on what that idea is and where that came from?
Yes, this is an idea that's being put forward by a bloke called Dr. James de Nicolantonio, who has a PhD in pharmacy, by the way, not biological process, not nutrition, not human metabolism, other than specifically related to his area of expertise, which is pharmacy. Okay. James also has hundreds and hundreds of peer-reviewed publications to his name. However, unfortunately, what James does not have is control of his ego, it seems, among other things. He also doesn't have command of the material that we'll be covering in the second part of this discussion when we talk about some of these rules. Because what James is saying is this: if you eat a diet which is devoid of what he's calling a balancing base intake, which is coming mainly in his mind from plant materials, He suggests that the eating of meat and animal fat solely causes what he's calling a low-grade acidosis, and that this acidosis is causing people to lose bone mineral density. And his idea is that in the lack of a clear statement to the contrary, that over the long term, over multi-decadal periods, a person who eats a carnivore diet can expect to experience a clinically significant, meaningful loss of bone mineral density, osteoporosis, fractures, and all the sequelae involved in that. The problem with this whole idea is that there is absolutely zero scientific support for it anywhere in the literature. The idea is based on James's, and not only James's. James actually he's not out of step with many of his colleagues in this regard, but he has this idea that the human body is capable of becoming acidic. It's false. The human body has very, very powerful homeostatic mechanisms that absolutely prevent this from occurring. There is no meaningful derangement of the pH of any of the fluid pools in the human body at any time, right up to the point immediately prior to a person's death, when the body gives up, stops maintaining that, and the person soon after that, minutes after that, will dutifully die. Okay? The whole model of the basic underpinning physics of aqueous pH control that James is using is from a generation gone. These are ideas that were put forward by people who do not understand the basic physics underpinning it. The whole underpinning model is false from the ground up as well. Further to that, James's supporting evidence for his claim is that he presents 2 or 3 papers, sometimes a few more papers than that. And when I say presents papers, what he does is he brings up a screenshot of the front page of a paper showing just the title of the paper and the first half of the abstract, which is usually cut off anyway because it's just a screenshot of the front page of a paper, and says, here's a paper that absolutely proves Bart K wrong. Right? That's not proving anything. That's putting a screenshot of a paper up on the screen. And then what he'll do is he'll highlight a section of that paper completely out of its context. In other words, out with the actual whole message of the paper, including its data. And that's his proof. Well, that's not acceptable, James. That's not how you prove your point. That's not how you litigate an argument scientifically. That's how you behave as someone whose ego is out of control, basically. Very similar to the way that Mike the Vegan does, and many of these other people with, shall we say, destitution of understanding of the science. So the papers that he puts forward are often small-scale studies of only a few people. Apologies if you can hear ducks in the background. Wifey has just let the ducks out for their morning carry-on, so they're doing their thing. It's a joyous thing to be a farmer as well these days. It's another thing I do. Anyway, small-scale studies, sometimes 10, 15, maybe 20, 25 people involved in these studies. Often the studies are over a very short period of time, say between 4 and 10 weeks duration, where he shows a statistically significant change in a signal without any reference to the noise around that signal. Don't worry if you don't understand these words. That's what we're talking about after we've dealt with this. And then extrapolating that short-term response in a small group of people who are completely unaccustomed to a diet containing only meat and fat, and extrapolating that short-term result to what we can expect in people over multiple decadal periods. Ridiculous. nonsensical, anti-scientific garbage from top to bottom. There's nothing to commend it whatsoever. And unfortunately, despite his hundreds of peer-reviewed publications, this point alone undermines the credibility of Dr. James de Nicolantonio completely. It's a sad thing.
Did he do the study?
No, they're not even studies he himself did that he's citing. His studies are in another field, which was my whole point anyway. But what he's doing is either, well, the two possibilities are that he absolutely does not have command of the scientific discipline and inference making, or he is misguiding people with malice aforethought in order to hawk some unnecessary and perhaps actually even contraindicated supplements.
Wow, got it.
It's one of those. So here it is. Yeah.
Thank you for that explanation. I also think it's valid to consider anecdote. Obviously, anecdote doesn't prove anything. You just never hear it. You don't hardly ever hear anybody on this long-term diet having bone issues whatsoever. Too many people have done DEXA scans and measured their bone density. It seems to get better, not worse. And you don't hear about people breaking bones very often who are eating carnivore. You don't really see the case studies. So again, that's just anecdote. It's not science, but it's still interesting to consider that. Yeah, you don't hardly ever hear about that. You would.
Well, that said, Casey, a bunch of anecdotes collected using correct discipline is a data set, and that is science. So long as you communicate about what your data is capable of establishing in a disciplined fashion. And that's where most commentators on science fall down. The reason they fall down in that is because they themselves do not have command of this conceptual material, which I'm going to give you all today. Some very basic, very simple things that you can go to straight away. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what they do is rely on what is said in the conclusion sections of the papers by the authors that have written those papers. What people need to understand is the section that's headed conclusions at the end of a paper, that's the one part of a paper where scientific authors are allowed and indeed invited to give their opinion about the data set. The opinion of the authors who collected the data is completely irrelevant to what the data says and what it is capable of establishing. Often those opinions that those authors put forward are bought and paid for by the people who paid for the study to be done in the first place. That's a fact, sadly. And as such, that's the one section of a paper that you probably shouldn't actually even read. If you are competent to read a scientific methodology to determine its veracity, to answer a question appropriately, and if you are competent to read that data set and statistically analyze it yourself competently, then you should do so. If you are not competent to read a methodology or a data set, with regard to what the science says, my friend, what you should do is keep your mouth shut. That's not your field, irrespective of what your credentials might be in another field. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, very clear and very important because people are used to seeing headlines all over the place that don't actually match what the actual data say, like you said. So yeah, I would love to step through some of the things that we can do. I think this would be a great guide for people to be able to evaluate some of the headlines and conclusions, like you said, and kind of root out the truth versus the falsehoods that are out there that are maybe benefiting people in financial ways.
Awesome. So here is where you put the start point of the lesson, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, and super intelligent shades of the colour sky blue pink. Here we go. When someone puts a paper in front of me and says, "Here's a paper that absolutely proves Bart came wrong," here are the questions you ask straight away. Number one, is the study that's being put in front of you a controlled observation in a metabolic ward lock-in situation on human beings? Is this an experimental piece of science under control? Because if it's not, in terms of discussion about cause and effect, we are done. Right there. Okay? Association, which is what most studies are. Most studies on human beings are associative, prospective cohort style studies. These are incapable, underline incapable twice, put that in block capitals if that's required, incapable of informing on cause and effect. I'll give you an example. If I do an associative study where I look at the sale of ice creams at Miami Beach on any given hot summer's day, and I correlate that with the incidence of sunburn suffered by people at Miami Beach that same day, I will find a very strong correlation between, on any given day, if I do this over multiple days throughout the summer, I am going to find a correlation between the sale of ice cream and the incidence of sunburn, am I not? Yes. Does that mean we deal with the sunburn problem by outlawing the sale of ice creams? No, that's ridiculous. That is what we're dealing with mostly in nutrition science, health science, etc. Why is that so? Well, it's very difficult financially, practically, and ethically to lock people in a laboratory for multiple decades in order to talk about the effect of any given intervention on people's health over multiple decades. You will not get that past ethics, ever. And even if you did, where is the money for a multiple decadal lock-in study coming from? And who's going to run it? What's the practicalities of that? Okay, so the response to that I normally get from people, indeed boys with high school diplomas who must know more than me about science because you see they can bench press 415 pounds, Richard Burgess, goodness sake, is that, the problem, Bart K, is that your epistemological standards are just unreasonable. No. What they're basically saying there is that Bart K is a science denier. No. Bart K insists upon science. I hope that's a clear distinction. What I'm saying is, to be unassailable in your argumentation, your discipline has to be unassailable. And if you are going to suggest that an associative study is able to inform on cause and effect, your credibility is done. Right there, you're finished. So that's the first thing. The first question is, okay, this study that I'm being shown that proves me wrong, is it a properly controlled, properly observed, properly tenured, metabolic ward lock-in study, an experimental piece of science? No? We're done. I hope that's really clear. Any questions on that?
Yeah, I would say one, just to prove your point and what you're saying. I could say to you, well, Professor K, we never did that with smoking and lung cancer, for example. Right. We never did a randomized controlled trial, and today that would also be considered ethical. Can you tell us the difference between the levels of association and why that matters to validate some associative studies out there, but why that doesn't work with nutrition?
Absolutely. And that is also a brilliant segue to point number 2 as well, just serendipitously, because Casey and I haven't discussed this beforehand.
No, we've not.
I've just said, look, I'd like to outlay these 5 things. But anyway, let's deal with that. An association between A and B has a certain value. There is a relationship between A and B for which we can draw a trend line, a line of best fit. It's called a regression line for those that want to know the mathematical term for it. What we have to understand is how powerful is that predictive value, they call it. It's not predictive. In fact, it's associative and it's nothing else, by the way. Some predictive values have more, weight in that the variation of individual data points around that trend line is much narrower. People fit the line better. or they fit the line worse. Okay, so for example, you could say that there was an association between X and Y that has a value, a slope on that trend line of 1 to 1. So for every value of X, there is an added value of Y. That's a straight line that goes up at 45 degrees through that graph, shall we say. However, if individual people are scattered all over that chart and nowhere near the actual trend line, the best fit line, then the R-squared value, the predictive value of that chart, is close to 0. Ergo, while you can say, well, the best fit through that line is a 1-to-1 relationship, in actual fact, people are hugely variant around that. There is massive noise around that signal, in which case that trend line is of no value to you, sort of thing, okay? In the case of smoking, of tobacco, and the incidence of lung cancer, the relationship is quite strong in that, don't quote me on the exact numbers, but I believe it's in the order of, for every pack year of smoking, a pack year meaning 20 cigarettes a day for a year, for every one of those exposures, there is an 11,500% increase in the incidence of lung cancers. Now, is that a cause and effect relationship? I might have an opinion on that, personally, because that's a pretty powerful finding. The noise around it is not huge. The scientific discipline requires me to say, no, that's not a cause and effect relationship, at least it's not established as such, because this is an associative study which is still incapable of making that call. We have to apply a reasonable, sensible opinion. Okay, so my opinion personally is I'm just not going to smoke tobacco on, a precautionary principle, because that's a pretty large increase in the incidence of an outcome associated with an input. In the case of anything whatsoever that you can talk about in terms of the outcome, hard health outcomes in human beings as that relates to any aspect of human nutrition, or most pharmacological drugs, the differences are so close to zero with such massive noise as that those data sets are meaningless, worthless. They're a joke to anyone who understands statistics at all. That's the problem. So, question number one, do we have an experimental data set that eliminates covariates, collinearities, confounders, controls absolutely everything except the experimental variable to establish cause and effect? No, it's an associative study. Great. Let's say there's an association and make our own opinions about the meaning of that association with an understanding of the value of its power to make predictions, shall we say, to use that terminology. That's fine. If we go over the line, however, and say this study here shows cause and effect when it does not, your credibility as a scientist or someone that comments on science is now done because you've broken the rules. You're over the line. Now, boys with high school diplomas, as I said, will say that's epistemologically unreasonable. No, what's unreasonable is making a claim that you cannot support. I'm unassailable, I'm in the right here, whether you like it or whether you don't like it. Sorry about that, Richard Burgess, and others. Others with much more credibility than Richard Burgess make this same mistake, by the way. So that's the first question. The second question, okay, if you've got an associative study, let's talk about the power of that association. What is the slope of the line and what is the noise around it? if you're unable to do that by looking at a data set yourself, then you, my friend, are not competent to publicly make any statement whatsoever about what the science says. Sorry. And as such, you should keep your mouth shut on that topic. So that's point 2. Point number 3 is a thing we call repeatability. Sometimes it's referred to as reliability. Here's what it is. If I measure your, well, let's go with an example that's from real life, from a study that I was involved in a few years ago. There's this idea that when exercise is undertaken, there is a build-up of lactate in the blood of the athletes undertaking the exercise, and the level of the lactate in the blood bears one of these relationships with the exercise intensity, the relative exercise intensity, relative to that individual athlete's maximum, i.e. the closer they are to their maximum, the higher the output of this substance lactate in their blood. And often this lactate level is used as a predictor of performance, falsely, but that's for another day. And it's also used as a gauge of training response after a period of training, also falsely, but that's also for another day. The point here is this. What we did, myself and some colleagues, is we got a bunch of cyclists to come into the lab on the same day of the week, 6 weeks in a row, having had the same breakfast that morning, having, this, that, the other, all the things that we could possibly get them to control as close to a proper controlled study as possible, right? And basically what we did is, under the assumption that everything else is under control and everything else is the same, what we're just doing is measuring the same athlete 6 weeks in a row without changing anything else. So there should be stability, concordance, and agreement between their blood lactate concentrations at any given work intensity 6 weeks in a row, assuming that they're not under a period of training where we would expect that to change. Right? Did we get that? Hell no. Excuse my French. Absolutely not. What we got was a spread of results for a given individual under the same circumstances pretty much that was so wide that a change in fitness status to detect with statistical power, which we'll talk about last, was so wide as to be completely unrealistic. In other words, there's no way we can detect this change and say statistically this is significant, this has power, this is meaningful, this has utility. Because a person measured again and again and again and again for the same variable was so all over the place that the noise around the signal rendered the signal useless. Most studies report signals. Signal means change in the variable from situation A to situation B. Okay? The noise around these signals in the literature is invariably so massive as to make the whole paper laughable to anybody who understands statistics at all. And yet, people are saying, the science shows, and they're splashing these papers up on the screen with conclusions from authors that are worded in such a way as to suggest that the paper is able to inform us in any usable way at all, when it's not, bought and paid for. And they're going, there you go, there's proof. The only thing that's proof of, my friend, is that you, if you're making those kind of comments out there, that you are incompetent to talk about the science. I hope this is going up some flagpoles. So that's number 3. Number 1, do we have an experimental study under control here? No, we're done. We have an association. Let's talk about associations, coincidental factors, and nothing else. Okay? All right, maybe we do have some kind of controlled study. Is the signal better than, or does it emerge from the noise? Is it a clear signal of utility, or do we just have noise here that could well be random? And when people say, well, this is statistically significant, that does not mean you're outside a signal-to-noise ratio problem. Statistical significance refers to a finding which is, usually its p is less than 0.05, which means there is less than a 5% chance that the difference between situation A and situation B in terms of our outcome variable, there's a 5% chance or less that that difference has occurred through parsimoniously, through dumb chance, and that it's not actually due cause and effect to the intervention that we've imposed. The way to get statistical significance on a very, very small change in signal is to have a very, very large sample size. Because statistically, mathematically, that reduces the chance that very, very small difference was due to dumb chance, and that it has something to do with whatever we've intervened on. However, that does not tell us that it's useful clinically or meaningfully in the real world. So hopefully that's a clear distinction. The fourth point, the fourth question is, once we get through all of that, if we do have a well-controlled experimental study, the signal stands out from the noise, it's clear, there's very little noise, there's very little variability. We can repeat the study any number of times we like and get the same result, not a different one. Here's my next question then. Please tell me about the statistical power, not the significance value, the power of this study. What is power? Well, mathematically, it's 1.0 minus the beta probability. For those that want to do the math, the beta probability is when you take two normal distribution curves, which is what you normally get when you measure people for anything, you get a normal curve mostly, and you move one of those bell-shaped curves with respect to the other one, so the value of the mean, the average, if you like, is different in these two charts that you're superimposing. The alpha value, 0.05, is how far does the mean move from the other mean with respect to the original mean? How many Z scores does it move? How many standard deviations does it move? Okay, 1.96 standard deviations, p is less than 0.05. Fantastic. What that doesn't account for is everything on the left, shall we say, if we've got an increase, everything on the left of the second situation, the increased one, everything below the mean value, that falls below that 0.05 level, that's the tail of the other curve, and it's the probability of a type 2 error. So type 1 error is a false positive, 0.05. Probability of a false negative, where we declare something to be insignificant when really it actually is, that's the beta probability. So the power of a study is 1 minus the beta probability. What we need in science, by way of just being an arbitrary decision made by those that have decided what the disciplines should be, is they say any study that has a power less than 0.08 is not reliable. So the next question I ask people is, great, we've got through the first three, that tick, 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 yes, great. What's the power of the study? And usually what you'll get is that the person will respond to you with an open mouth and silence, because they don't know. In which case, my friend, guess what? You are not competent to speak about what the science shows publicly. And as such, you should keep your mouth shut on the topic. You need to understand this. You need to be able to do this mathematics yourself on a data set. Okay, people that think you can read a paper and its conclusions and be competent to talk about what the science says, it's ridiculous. That would be like me claiming to be competent to be a psychiatrist. I'm not trained in psychiatry. Someone like Paul Saladino is. He's a psychiatrist. although he doesn't practice and never has, by the way, not one single day in his life. He went straight to being a social media influencer, having completed his rotation in psychiatry. So Paul Saladino is a trained allopathic doctor, MD, and he's done a rotation in psychiatry, so he is now a qualified psychiatrist, despite never practicing. What does that mean? It means Paul Saladino is competent to speak publicly to people about psychiatry or allopathic medicine, not what the science says. In the same way that I absolutely am competent, very competent, to speak about what the science says, I am not competent to speak about psychiatry. People need to understand this. Most notably, people who are psychiatrists need to understand this, and they need to stop making comments about what the science says, because they are not competent. I hope that's clear. In the same way that if I burst a pipe in my house, I'm not going to ring an electrician. I'm going to ring a plumber. That's just common sense, surely. Anyway, that said, those are the top 4. So, experimental study, properly controlled, was it? Okay. Is the signal-to-noise ratio good? Can we see a clear signal out with the noise? Good. Yes, okay. Is the study repeatable? Could we do this again and again and again and get the same result? Yes or no? Does it have statistical power? Is 1 minus beta above 0.8? Fantastic. 4 out of 5. Let's see if we've got the 5th thing sorted out. And it goes a bit like this. If I want to talk about the likely outcome in a given human being or group of human beings over a given period of time, let's say multiple decades, do I have a study that is controlled, has good signal-to-noise ratio, good repeatability, acceptable power, that lasted as long as the assertion that I'm about to make? So if I'm going to say over 4 decades, 5 decades, here's what we can expect by way of outcome, do I have a study that was conducted for 4 or 5 decades on human beings locked into a lab, observed under control? So if we get through the first 4, which is very, very rare indeed, as rare as rocking horse poo, then we ask question 5. Great. How long did that study go on for? James de Nicolantonio. Oh, 10 weeks? Ergo, what can we say about 11 weeks? Or 3 months? Or 3 years? Or 30? Not a damned thing. We cannot extrapolate a trend observed over one time frame to a longer time frame. We do not know that the signal that we saw will continue unchanged. We do not know that a straight line will continue to be straight. We do not know that a curvilinear function will continue in that vein. It may turn around, flatten, and go back down again. So, when you are presented with a study that absolutely proves X, Y, or Z as regards hard human health outcomes with respect to pretty much anything nutritionally or pharmacologically or any of that stuff, those are the 5 questions. Normally, you don't need to get past question 1. But if you do, there are 4 more questions that you can ask there that can absolutely tip that over. You will win that argument, and I say win with inverted speech marks around it because there's no such thing as winning an argument, by the way. There is no such thing, I can promise you. What you can do, however, though, is show your comprehension, your understanding of the disciplines of inference making in science, and you can show superiority to another person's argument simply by tapping those 5 questions in order. Absolute pleasure. There we go. Any questions on that to fill in the rest of the hour?
Just applause all around. That was a masterclass. I absolutely love that. I would caution the listener watching this on YouTube, when you apply these principles, even if it's just, not an argument, but you're just trying to figure out what to eat for yourself. How should I construct my diet? What things are good for me? What things are not good for me? I think a lot of people care about that stuff, but I would warn the person that, like, man, you're going to see it everywhere, including well-respected journals. You're going to see it on news channels or newspapers that you might highly trust. You might see it in organizations that you might also trust, like the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association. Don't assume that because a pharmaceutical, advertisement says you're going to have such and such improvement of such thing, or the American Heart Association says that red meat is going to kill you, or whatever. Like, you think you can trust some of these things. That they're not following these standards. They're getting out to what most people would consider to be very reputable, and they get published. And so again, I would just as you're looking for this and keeping your eyes out for this, you might find this in places that you wouldn't think you would.
Exactly. I think an overarching guiding principle for people should be, when someone talks to you about what science says, even if you don't understand anything I've said today of those 5 questions, even if you don't get that, you need to understand that the thing that underpins science, and for those that are listening and not watching, I'm waving a $20 bill. Science says what the people who pay for science tell the scientists that it says. It's bought and paid for, all of it, with regard to human health outcomes. Absolutely, the whole industry is vile, foul, ill-disciplined, and compromised to its very core. And that's coming from someone who has worked at that coalface as part of that problem for 2 decades before my redemption, seeing the light and going, you know what? I'm not going to be involved in this anymore. I'm going to go and tell people what's the original idea around science was supposed to be, as an unassailable, disciplined, rigorous process of epistemology, a way of knowing things. Okay, so the guiding principle really is this. If your level of comprehension of the science is such that all you can do is pick up a science paper and read the conclusion section and read the opinion of the authors of that paper, then actually you are not competent. I hope that's come through, if nothing else. And as such, if you are someone who speaks publicly to people about what the science says, and you're in that boat of someone who can't actually do this math yourself, can't go and look at a data set, do a statistical analysis, answer these 5 questions that I've spoken about today for yourself, and defend that against someone that wants to take a contrary position, you need to stop talking about science publicly. You are out of your league. You are out of your lane. If you are, for example, an MD, talk about that. If you're a psychiatrist, talk about that. Sure. But don't come online and talk about what the science says, because you'll find yourself on the sharp end of my tongue. I promise you, as long as there's strength in my body to do so. So there it is, Casey.
I love it. Well, man, I'm kicking myself. Regrettably, I don't have the 90 minutes that you have today. But I think that's a wonderful takeaway of this conversation. And the message about the money is totally clear. Like look at who is making money off of this, and you'll understand the motives and why the headlines look the way that they do. And it's not for your benefit. And bringing that to the light has always been just such a passion of yours, and has really helped a lot of people. So I'm certainly very appreciative of you and all of your work, and I know our listeners and watchers are as well. Thank you for all of that. I hope people walk away with a lot of really good practical tips and can start to read the science for themselves. And again, whether they're talking about it online or just making personal decisions for themselves, can be a little bit more confident in that regard. But anyway, Professor K, always enjoyed speaking with you. Where would you like people to go to find you and connect with you and your work?
Absolutely. The best thing you can do to find me is go to YouTube, type in BART-KAY. You found me.
Easy. We'll link that in the show notes. I'll link up some of your other social media channels as well. But like I said, thank you so very much again for taking the time to come on our show today and educate people. Again, it's just such a passion of yours, and it benefits a lot of people. So, and selfishly, I really enjoyed chatting with you and seeing that as you're aging, you're looking better and better over time. It gives me a lot of hope as I'm aging as well. So, Professor K, thank you so very much for all the work you do, and thank you for taking time to be on our show again today for the third time. Really, really appreciate you.
No, thank you for having me. It's an absolute privilege and a pleasure. And I'll come back as many times as you'll have me.
Beautiful. I will definitely have you back for we always learn a lot. So thank you so much. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.